Welcome all the distinguished panel and the esteemed participants who have joined us today for this interesting discussion today on a very important theme. And that has to do with the potential China-Iran economic security deal. It seems like it just got more active in the news. It seems like it still has to be ratified by the Iranian parliament to go into effect. But initially, it seems like media reports indicate that the talks were going on since 2016. So we want to put this in perspective. There's no doubt that we're in the midst of escalating shift in the balance of power. And that's nothing new. That has been our history, the history of the world, emerging powers, established powers. There comes a time that there is a change in the power and it moves towards imbalance. And tragically, it ends up with a big conflict, little conflicts leading into big conflicts. And then after that, a period of time, maybe a new order emerges. Hopefully, we are not going towards repeating the history, but nonetheless, there is shift in the balance of power. And there are obviously different reasons that are causing the shift in the balance. Maybe there is a perception that there is a weakening in one block. Maybe there's a perception that somebody is getting stronger, and that's playing in the dynamics as well. But then there are other factors that have caused this tussle between the global powers to escalate. And one of them has to do with the global climate change that is playing out, obviously. There is conflict, obviously, and in these parts of the world, South Asia, Middle East, have severely been impacted by the war against terror or war against extremism. And what we have seen lately, that even that has gotten intertwined with these balance of power tussles. But nonetheless, the most important factor, obviously, is the COVID-19 now. All of a sudden, none of us had foreseen that. And that has changed the dynamics, obviously, quite a bit. Not only in the terms of our daily life, but politics, economics, and security. And from what we can see, everybody is reevaluating their postures. Where do they stand? Obviously, we don't know where we are in this phase of pandemic. Initially, we thought it was going to be 3 months and it's going to be over. Now it seems like it's a new normal. Every continent, every nation is trying to tackle with it on their own. Trying to find the best approach. But when all is said and done, we may have new winners and losers, who knows? And that's causing tension in the balance of power as well. And that may have caused China as well to reassess its posture. It seems like, at least from Washington, DC, where I am, that there is a realization that China is asserting. What's causing China to assert could be different reasons. I mean, there could be, at least in that South Asia part of the world, where there are tensions between China and India on the border, Ladakh side, and along the border line of actual control, and the abolition of the special status of Kashmir. That may have incited, or that may have caused China to assert itself. But this tension wasn't new. This was it was going on even before the COVID. And then in the midst of this, we had a change of administration in the US. There was a time during Obama administration, there was a push towards coexistence. And I remember a phrase from President Obama in 2013, which he made after meeting President Xi, that there is enough space in the Pacific for two global powers. They can coexist for US and China. But obviously, we have come a long way since then, and President Trump came into power. American first mantra came in. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was abolished. And it seems like we are moving towards the zero-sum environment again, as opposed to maybe the win-win, which may have been the context of the globalization, or even how China presents its strategic stance as win-win. But nonetheless, we seem to be moving towards the zero-sum and how that's playing out now. And so it is in this context that I wanted to move forward with this discussion. And we have assembled a very distinguished panel. We have Ambassador Mustafa Kamal Qazi. Uh, he's a vice chairperson from the Karachi Council on Foreign Relations. He has been the ambassador of Pakistan to Russia, Netherlands, Iraq, and Indonesia. And I was looking on Google and I saw him standing next to Putin. So maybe he can give us his personal opinions regarding President Putin as well. And the think tank he's associated with, Karachi Council on Foreign Relations. We have the chairman of that important think tank, Mr. Ikram Sehgal, with us as well. They had an important event last week particularly on CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and in which the chairman of the authority, Lieutenant General Bajwa, President of Pakistan, Arif Alvi, they presented their views on the regional developments and how they see the future of CPEC. And Mr. Ikram Sehgal himself made some very interesting comments, which had to do with the complementary nature of what's happening with Chabahar and Gwadar. And then we have Mr. Khalid Al-Maina. He's a very known popular media anchor person from Saudi Arabia. He has been in various senior positions. Most importantly, from today's context, is that he was the editor of two popular Saudi newspapers, or should I say Arab newspapers, Arab News and Saudi Gazette. And we'll be talking to him that how he's seeing this development from the vantage point where he is, and especially, the emerging the Saudi-Iran relations, and obviously the Saudi relations with Pakistan and India. Interestingly, Mr. Khalid has lived in Pakistan as well, knows Urdu, and he travels to India as well. So he has a very deep understanding of the dynamics of this region. And he doesn't mention it, but he knows many world leaders personally. And if you search, he has known Mr. Yasser Arafat and Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad, and many others. But he's very humble. He doesn't display that. So I'm sure he will, his experience will help us a lot in understanding how this development is being understood in the Gulf region and Saudi Arabia. Last but not least, we have Dr. Claude Requesets, and I miss him in Washington. We had good tea breaks and lunches here to discuss the developing world. But ever since he has moved on to Australia, he's an honorary professor at the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the Australian National University. And before that, he has held important positions as well, being an academic advisor at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, the Senior Staff College at the Australian Defense College. He's also taught at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And he closely follows the Pacific region and the Middle East. And his PhD dissertation was on Pakistan as well. So he has very close connection with this area as well. So stating all of this, I would like to invite Mr. Sehgal to just say a few introductory comments and before we go into the discussion.
Thank you, Arif. First, let me please express my gratitude to all the panelists, because I know all of them personally. I know how eminent they are. And it is very important because some time or the other, I have interacted with them. Um, Ambassador Muswa Kazi, of course, is one of the stalwarts of KCFR. Without him, KCFR would not be here where it is today. Mr. Khalid Al Maina, of course, I stand corrected. My slip of the tongue. Arab News, he gave me the first chance. My card was to appear in Saudi Arabia for many years, right? And it was only when he left Arab News that I left writing for Arab News. And then, of course, later on, things developed beyond that. And Mr. Cloud Rustickets, of course, you've been, we had at least a couple of sessions together. And I want to take you back to the session we had almost 10 years ago. And if you remember, I said Pakistan is part of the solution and India is part of the problem. The reason is very simple. The reason is Pakistan has a South Asian identity. Pakistan has a Central Asian identity. And Pakistan has a Middle Eastern identity. And today, if you look at the developments that have taken place, this had to happen. When Shah Bahar was coming up, already Iran and Pakistan, despite the differences and despite the fact India was very much in the driving seat at Chabahar, we're talking about a road and railway link between Gwadar and Chabahar and Gwadar as sister ports. Now, as somebody who has been 50 years been associated with the Karakoram Highway, because I flew a helicopter in the Karakoram mountains and making the early part of the Karakoram Highway, which is actually the most difficult part before it comes down to the plains. We look at the topography. The point is very simple. It is a natural linkage. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor just requires two more connections. One connection already exists through Zahida, but the other connection very short distance between Gwadar, which I think is a major problem. And that is that we cannot afford the US from disengaging from this region. As much as, we are benefiting from China's largesse, we are actually really this thing, etc. But we cannot, sort of lose the engagement with the United States or line up with Iran against Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is absolute vital to our is a vital friend of ours, and we cannot afford there to take sides. We can act as a good intermediary. We can act as a good intermediary to solve a lot of problems. We've had a very rough time for 20 years, 30 years. India has used Afghanistan as a platform against Pakistan. It's the cheapest war that they've ever fought. First with Russian lives and Afghan lives and Afghanistan's destruction, and then with American lives and American money against Pakistan. Now, the things are changing rapidly, and rapidly in the sense that when the BRI is in existence and the Fifth Fleet and the Seventh Fleet virtually become on pleasure cruise because they lose their effectiveness as a maritime power so that they can interdict sea routes. But that, I've been saying this as a board member of East-West Institute in the USA. I've been saying this repeatedly again and again and again. United States must remain engaged with this region. It would not be correct for the United States to disengage. And at the moment, as Arif Saab has pointed out, we are seeing the disengagement of the United States, at least from our part of the region. Pakistan is the most important country, or at least that we are a bridge We are a bridge, a vital bridge. We are a vital bridge to the coast, the Indian Ocean, a vital bridge to central China. We are a vital bridge to central Russia and to the Central Asian states. And we, of course, facilitate the movement to Eastern Asia or Western Asia and Europe. So with that, I think I have gone past my allotted introductory remarks, but I would urge you, please, to understand that whatever our political feelings may be, whatever our emotional feelings may be, today we must ensure that we remain balanced as far as our relationships are concerned. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you, Mr. Kram, for providing this context and some insights. And let us proceed now to the discussion further. I'll go first to Ambassador Kazi and ask him a similar question, how he sees this development, the potential China-Iran economic security deal vis-a-vis CPEC. In the discussion that happened last week at the Karachi Council on Foreign Relations, it was mentioned as complementary. And I remember some time back, Sartaj Aziz, at that time Foreign Minister of Pakistan, had commented the same when there were media reports rife that what is the position of Chabahar vis-a-vis Gwadar. And he even mentioned that there is going to be a road built between Gwadar and Chabahar. I don't know if that ever happened. But nonetheless, now we have, I guess, the foundation for that. But nonetheless, let me go to you for your opinions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ansar. My greetings to all participants. For sure, the China-Iran likely agreement is really of very vast magnitude and will be a major breakthrough for Iran, as it will provide much needed relief from the suffocating US sanctions, besides other benefits. But before we draw alarming regional and global scenarios, we need to objectively look at the legitimate mutual interest of both Iran and China. Whether the prospective deal violates international law, whether the Trump administration's unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal and other polarizing actions in the region have in fact facilitated the deal. China is world's largest fossil fuel importer. It gets more than 40% of its oil supplies from the Gulf. Therefore, for Iran, China is a key market for its crude oil exports. After Washington's withdrawal from the nuclear deal with Tehran 2 years back, Chinese imports from Iran have drastically reduced. China, as a co-signatory, wants compliance to the deal. Therefore, both for China and Iran, Trump administration's unilateral withdrawal from the UN-endorsed, universally acclaimed nuclear agreement with Iran was a great betrayal and, in fact, violation of international law. Trump administration not only reimposed sanctions, but even made them more hurting for the people of Iran. Therefore, Tehran's desperation rose further because of COVID-19 crisis and painful economic situation, American belligerency, and the recent cyber attacks on its nuclear and naval installations. So naturally for Iran, China, a rising superpower, offering an insatiable oil market, military and civilian technology, massive investment, and a dependable ally on a global stage with a veto in the UN Security Council are all good things that China needs. Washington should realize that this deal has been actually facilitated by Trump administration's ill-advised unilateral withdrawal from Iran nuclear deal. US emerged as the main driver of Cold War international order, but it has grossly mismanaged its unipolar moment and an era of uncontested primacy. The damage is self-inflicted. And in the context of the Middle East, by the Israeli-inspired policy of forever wars, particularly after 9/11. The world now lives in new reality, whether we like it or not. With rising China, assertive Russia, lasting shifts in the global economy and technology, the world is moving towards a transformed geopolitical landscape and a much needed multipolar order. One Belt, One Road project of China seeks to promote inter and intra-regional connectivity through industrial, economic, and infrastructure development. This $1 trillion initiative is unique and perhaps largest ever investment and infrastructure endeavor in human history, covering more than 68 countries, 65% of global population, and 40% of world's GDP. It is a new global growth engine which will bring Asia, Europe, and Africa closer. China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, as we popularly know it, is a landmark project. It will pilot Belt and Road initiative towards regional connectivity. Pakistan is eminently placed to do so, given its geographical location, linking South Asia with Central Asia and West Asia. We in Pakistan are confident that CPEC will transform our country, not only our country, but entire region. We have successfully completed first phase of this gigantic three-phase multi-dimensional project and substantially covered gaps in our energy and infrastructure. Conceptually, the infrastructure linkage with Iran is natural for CPEC, as also the connectivity with Afghanistan and beyond. Though the prospective Iran-China deal is a bilateral agreement, infrastructural linkage with CPEC is obvious for regional cooperation and beyond. Pakistan's relations with Gulf Council countries have been historically close. Both have contributed towards each other's progress and prosperity. China's role in the Middle East has always been constructive. It is perhaps the only major power which enjoys good relations and mutually beneficial economic relations with all countries in the region. Besides petroleum imports, China is a major investor in GCC countries. Sadly, during the past few decades, despite enormous resources, we have seen horrendous destruction of five member Arab League member countries because of fratricidal conflicts and foreign invasions. All countries in the region must do some introspection. They must realize, except greedy arms merchants and their patrons in the West, perhaps, there will be no winners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kazi, for your comments and for your insight into this development, on how this development is being perceived in Pakistan or the wider, how it relates to the wider CPEC projects. Let me go now to Mr. Khalid Almaina and pose a question to him that Middle East is the region where Pakistan traditionally had influence and backing and relied on that support. And recently we had seen India's influence grow in the Arab world. I don't know if I would go as far as undercutting Pakistan's support or not, but nonetheless, it was a factor. And now we see China exerting influence as well. Russia is obviously more involved towards the Syrian side and not necessarily this part of the world, GCC. But nonetheless, China-Iran deal kind of demonstrates that maybe this is China's, through Iran, this is China's pivot to the Middle East. But China has been building ties, strategic ties with Saudi Arabia as well over the years. And it also has good relations with Israel. It has economic and defense ties with Israel. How are you seeing this development, the potential China-Iran deal, and what it means for the region, generally, broadly speaking?
Well, I will be, I'm surprised that the Saudi or Gulf Arab states with the United States have been having relations for over 70 years. And with China, we started our relation in 1990 after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. But surprisingly, as you said, how do you see this? In the 30 years, I think China has eclipsed the United States in terms of the strength of the relationship. In 1990 was the first visit. Until the year 2000, 2005, China was still in the backwaters. They used to get goods and all. But China is beginning to play a great role in the Middle East in terms of trade, in terms of some strategic moves that they have done. The Gulf states now have to balance their relationship between the United States and China and also act as a platform to see to it that there will not be any transgression by either side. So you have to have very strong diplomacy, you have to have a crafty vision, in fact, to see to it that this doesn't happen. Now, China is a sovereign nation, and I think both before me, Mr. Sehgal said that the Americans should be there. Yes. And I remember that book that President Ayub Khan wrote many years ago, Friends, Not Masters. So they should be there as friends and not come in and dictate policy to the area, which they are very gung-ho at doing. Then also Ambassador Mustafa spoke about the need for a greater economic cooperation because China has an insatiable need for oil. The Iranians need all kinds of assistance because due to sanctions, because due to abrupt policies by the United States, the lack of dialogue. So they are in need, they are a bit suspicious. So in that sense that both countries should be there, but we should not use one against the other. We should try to see to it that at least for the Gulf states, there should be a balance between China and the United States. You see, this is one. When Mr. Arif, you spoke about Pakistan, yes, the Saudi-Pakistan relationship, unlike the other relationship of the Gulf states, time of King Faisal, when there was military cooperation, when the Saudis needed their hardware to be manned, their hardware to be maintained. So it was the Pakistan Air Force, the Navy, until even a few years ago. But now, of course, they're being more and more independent. India has crept in because, unfortunately, the internal politics of Pakistan, so the news that was always coming out of Pakistan was that of security problems and issues, changes and all. India started emerging and catching the eye, not only of the government, by the way, but also of the people in the Gulf by being a leader in the IT. So the people were looking at India with more respect, and the Indians did something more. They started putting their own people in various positions of economic power, media power in the United States. So India was getting better press, and people would say, okay, these are people who man 40% of the Fortune 500 companies. They're doing a great lot. They're contributing to civilization, quote unquote, although I may have doubts about it. So that is how India started creeping in. So the Saudis then started investing, research centers in Ahmedabad, in other places. Aramco, a Tata company, came and employed 2,000 women in Saudi Arabia at one go. So you see the positive image of India began to emerge, and Pakistan sort of rescinded in the background. But yet the emotional attachment to Pakistan exists. But as I said, that emotions are not enough to bring food to the table. You see, this is very important also for Pakistan to bring something to the table, a dialogue, have more trade relations, scientific research and all, which unfortunately was not happening. Change of leadership in the Gulf states, as you know, was formed in GCC in 1981. All those people who had affinity with Pakistan have now gone. There's a younger leadership. The attachment to these roots that existed between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have lessened, but that does not mean all is lost. What is needed is really confidence-building measures between both parties, trying to come up with something new on the table, and then also allay any fear that if you are one thing with somebody, you're against the other. The Indians, of course, are suspicious. They always would say that Saudi Arabia is looking at India through the prism or the looking glass of Pakistan. Now that has gone aside. So I think we all have to understand in the final analysis that the region, whether the GCC countries as one unit or individual countries, have to first look out for their own interests, not be pawns in a China, US, India power struggle. See to it that there will be some kind of peace initiative and parleys between them and not be used by these superpowers.
Thank you very much, Khalid Al-Maina sir, for your perspective and putting things in context based on how Mr. Ikram and the speakers earlier, Ambassador Qazi, had alluded to some of the points, the ties between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as China and Iran emerge into this discussion. Let me go to Dr. Cloud now and try to understand his perspective from the vantage point of the Pacific. As was mentioned earlier, this is definitely a transcontinental webinar. We have almost all areas covered, not necessarily all, but at least different vantage points. Dr. Claude, and we were discussing, I think, a couple of weeks ago that how is China going to get involved in the Middle East, and soon enough we saw the reports of the China-Iran nuclear deal. So it poses a number of questions. First of all, how do you see China playing in the Middle East, where US has always been there, actively, Russia is involved, and China is now getting in? And how does this correlate with the Indo-Pacific strategy or the emerging Quad strategy that is in play?
Well, thank you, Arif, and thank you very much for inviting me on this this panel. I'm really happy to finally virtually meet everyone here on the internet. Look, two big questions you've just asked me, and the problem coming last is a lot of things have already been covered. But just turning to the Middle East, and of course, Khalid Al-Amin has already covered most of it. You asked me whether or not this is sort of the Chinese pivot to the Middle East. I wouldn't use that term pivot because it's got bad connotations, especially in Washington, mainly because there was no pivot, and whatever pivot there was didn't go so well. So I don't think there is there. I think the more I see it is China is progressively moving westwards with its BRI, and now it's got to Iran. And I think before it wants to get involved in the difficult and complicated waters of the Middle East, I think China would want to consolidate its big win here with the Iran-China deal. I think this is really, really important, especially as the other speakers have said. I personally see this whole Iran-China deal as very much something that would fit very nicely, and we can talk about this later, very nicely with the whole BRI and, of course, with CPEC next door with Pakistan. So I don't see China getting too involved in purely Middle Eastern issues at this point in light of the Iran-China deal, but who knows what will happen later. The thing to remember, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will agree, is this deal as far as Americans would be concerned and Saudi Arabia would be concerned, would not go down very well at all. As we know, Iran is no friend of the United States, but we also know that it's thanks to President Trump that Iran has been pushed into the arms of China for investment due to the sanctions, and certainly Beijing and President Xi was more than happy to oblige to assist. So, as far as I see it, and as the other speakers have said, especially Ambassador Kazi, this is a very, very big deal. Next to take CPEC, which was originally $46 billion, this is a $400 billion agreement. This is very big, and it has massive ramifications. Now, turning to the perspective here as how does the question you asked me, Arif, about how does this fit, how does it intersect with America's Indo-Pacific strategy? Again, I've sort of touched on that now. The fact is, this is not going to go down well at all in Washington, at all, because the whole point of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and I'm talking here from being in Canberra, which feels very different from being in Washington or anywhere else for that matter. We're much closer to China, although still pretty far, but much closer than Washington. The whole thing about Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy is, and they won't use this term, is really to contain or to keep China within its borders. And we know that. And of course, China's reaction to that is to counter that by, as we all know, try to push back the United States away from the first island chain and push it back to the second island chain. And part of all that is, of course, the massive construction of the artificial islands in the South China Sea. This is a very, very big issue in the region here, because eventually China would want to turn the South China Sea, using the historical 9-dash line claims, into effectively a Chinese lake. And this is why the United States, on a regular basis, has these freedom of navigation patrols going through the South China Sea to say, no, this is not going to work, this is illegal, and we will go within the 12 nautical miles. The Australia, incidentally, has never done these, has never participated in these patrols, not because it doesn't want to do these patrols, it actually has never done these sort of patrols. Now, what part of this strategy is, of course, we then bring in the whole idea of the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is a loose coalition of 4 countries, the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. No one wants to say it, but it's pretty much focused against China. Now, this has been around since 2007. It's didn't go very far for a while, but now it's been revised. There's more and more activity of things happening, doing things together in the Pacific. And so that's going to have some sort of life, and the United States certainly would like to activate that a bit more. So what's happened with the Iran-China deal, coming back to that, is that, of course, this is going to be, even though the whole Indo-Pacific strategy is very much focused on the Pacific, this Iran-China deal in the long term is not good news for Washington's strategy, because, of course, it provides China with a very strong, a very powerful, certainly potentially strategic footprint in the Western Indian Ocean. And if you combine that with its very close relationship with Pakistan and Qatar, and of course, the fact that it also has its first foreign military base in Djibouti, you can see that China potentially has quite a large naval military potential in that region. And this is, and the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and also which involves the Quad, is to try to make sure that India, in this case, can be an active participant. And China sees this, and this is why China is very busy in trying to box in India on the continent, so it does not have the time or the resources to be able to project outwards into the Indian Ocean. I'll leave it at that because I can see we're fast running out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claude. Now that we are at you, let me ask you a follow-up question and start from you as we go towards kind of the Q&A. And that has to do with the questions of sanctions. Iran is under sanctions, and previously Europe has tried to do deals with Iran, and which were quite lucrative. US itself, Boeing signed a $100 billion deal soon after easing of the sanctions when the Iran nuclear deal was signed. But then it started to reverse. So the question is, yes, sounds very potentially very interesting and lucrative, but is China going to use this as a leverage against US in negotiations, meaning the Iran deal, knowing very well that this is under sanctions and many things could not go forward? And I use the precedence of Russia, for example, using its dealings with Iran in negotiations with US and in defense equipment. For example, I remember quite well that with the supply of S-300 or S-400, air defense systems, Russia would use it as a leverage that we were going to give it to Iran, and then something would happen with the negotiations with the rest of the US, and then is China doing something similar in its relation with the West or US to use this as a leverage, or this is actually potentially going to move forward?
I don't know all the details, of course, of the deal, but I suspect that, China is a very, very big country, and this is why this Iran-China deal was possible, in that with the European countries, they got scared with the sanctions and the threat of American sanctions against European countries or European, entities that do deals with Iran. They could be threatened. China does not have to worry about that, and I think it will use it. And if China can easily push back, and it has. And I think it will use this whole Iran-China deal to its benefit. And if it can link this up with CPEC, and also, as you know, it's going to build probably the railroad to Afghanistan, and will be developing Chabahar, which Chabahar combined with Gwadar, which inevitably will happen, will be a massive, commercial hub, which China will be able to use with the oil from Iran. That all can be pumped through Gwadar and the oil facility that will be built by Saudi Arabia. So I think China is just going to go right ahead. We'll use it as a leverage against the United States. But as we know, and we certainly see this here in Canberra here, the relationship between China and the United States are not going well at all, stating the obvious. And I don't think it's going to get much better for quite a while. And China will use this to its benefit.
Thank you, Claude. The next question is, I'm going to pose it to Dr. Khalid and Ambassador Kazi. And that has to do with the history and how we relate history to the present. In the past, often the Muslim parts of the world supported different global powers and ended up fighting each other sometimes, supporting one global power against the other. And I made a reference in my introduction that history is playing out here as well. We have Russia, China, US as the global players. What can be done and we have the tensions now, the Saudi, Iran, and now Turkey is the new player in all of this, that are creating the tugs and pull. And what can be done within the OIC or whatever organization there is to prevent being pulled into these different configurations? Let me ask Khalid Al-Maina Saab first.
I think you need statesmen and not politicians. You need people with foresight and farsight and people who are committed to the well-being of their people rather than be pawns. So we should not be drawn, and I've always said this, in any conflict with any people powers, whether East or West. If you remember the 50s and the 60s, the Arab world was the socialist side like Egypt, it was Syria, Iraq was with the Soviet Union, the other side of the fence, the Gulf states sided. So there was the Baghdad Pact, CENTO, and as Mr. Ikram said, CETO, which was Pakistan, but again had close connection with the Middle East. We should not be part of that. I think it's important for us to see to it that our interests are our priority. We should not also believe that we can survive at the behest of other powers. To have faith in yourself, to be committed to your people, to create institutions, to build a strong economy, build a process where there is rule of law, where there is a commitment, where there's participation, and where we all see the larger picture rather than the smaller picture. We should not indulge in jingoism at the behest of any other power. So I think this is very important. Now you spoke about the OIC. I'm a bit skeptical. I think, the OIC is, it's a good thing when it comes to having projects, social, economic, and all. But politically, it's very difficult to get all these people, even the Arab League people, to agree on a certain issue, because they will always have diverse views on that. So I don't think so, with my due apologies to the OIC, that it will be able to sort of have a cohesive platform so that we can deal with either side. So, but anyway, if the leaders in the Arab world and the Muslim world realize that their main and first and prime duty is towards their own people and to the interests of their countries, then I think that itself would be a half victory for us.
Thank you, Khalid Saab. Let me go to Ambassador Qazi and take his take on this.
Well, China and US are big powers. They have too many leverages with each other. They will manage that matters. They know their red lines also. My concern is with the region, our region. Now, Pakistan, surely, as Mr. Khalid Al-Manai said, that we need to come up economically to make our imprint in the region. We will, through the CPEC, I think we will manage it, and not long from now, hopefully. As far as Iran and neighboring GCC countries are concerned, they must resolve their differences to march with times. If Iran is suffering, situation in the Arab world on the whole is even worse. For instance, as I mentioned, that 6 of the Arab League member states have really been crippled through these invasions and fratricidal conflicts. Egypt has threatened war against Ethiopia and Turkey, although it is struggling with its domestic issues. The objective of the Arab League was to develop close relations between member states and to, quote, safeguard the independence and sovereignty. I think this record is very poor, as nobody should be proud of. And now what happens in the Arab world affects very much to the rest of the Islamic countries. And they really hold the key. Okay, OIC may not be an effective organization, yes, I agree, but there is, whatever happens in the Arab world, especially in the key Islamic countries, it affects the whole Islamic world. Iraq, Baghdad, Damascus have been historical centers. I mean, if these two capitals are now, take for example Istanbul and Cairo, I mean, something happens to them. It affects the emotional nerves in the rest of the Islamic world. So Arabs should take note of this and address their own issues first, and then also have a more sort of a congenial attitude to rest of the region. There are Pakistan, for instance, and if you compare Pakistan and India, we have been running sort of up and down with each other. If you go by the early 90s, our GDP was 65% more than India. Then in the 2000s, until today, it is about 35%. If you talk in terms of per capita, it is 35% less. So, India is a big country with a large population. So it has to be judged in that context. But question is that matters of peace and prosperity in the region, Pakistan has a very key role, more than India, if one looks at it. And also the entire context of harmonious and relationship in the whole region. So I think we in the region have to really make efforts to bridge the differences and to move with times, because I don't think USA is a country which is going to be, calling shots as it did soon after the collapse of Cold War. It has really impaired itself in its maneuverability. China is an emerging power, both in the context of economic power and technological power. So, and it's a very constructive force. For instance, Belt and Road Initiative itself is a $1 trillion initiative. It is very unique that a country moves to first develop the regions, and then between the regions it creates a kind of a linkages and moves on globally. This is something that has never happened in the world, even if we talk in terms of a Marshall Plan. So this is a great initiative. I don't think United States can match it. Today, as it is, China gives as much as developer assistance as United States. So, these are very important factors which normally we all ignore because the mainstream is dominated by the Western media. So a lot of things that China can, from the Chinese context, get overshadowed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Qazi. Khalid Saab, would you like to respond or?
Well, I think Ambassador Mustafa hit the nail, and I think you can summarize everything by a sentence that used: good economics makes good politics. I think this is a historical thing, the Belt and Road Initiative. It can be a gateway to the Arab world. It can involve people, and once you are connected economically, I think the chances of conflict would be devastating to everybody else. So I agree with you, Ambassador, that this is very important. The Beltway and the CPEC will be bridges towards cooperation to each other. We should not overlook, again, going back to what Mr. Ikram said, the American presence. At the same time, America cannot dictate to countries in the region, especially countries like China, of what to do or not to do. So I think I personally am optimistic if these plans are realized, they will really bring a lot of economic boom and prosperity to the people of the area.
Thank you, Khalid Saab. Let me pose a question from the audience to Claude, which has to do with the Chinese role in the region. And it's asking that since China doesn't bring in any baggage, can it? Yeah, please go ahead, Mr. Ikram.
I think one thing we are forgetting, and please do remember that there was a treaty called CENTO, Central Treaty Organization, which used to consist of Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey primarily. And then, of course, there's an economic side, which became the Regional Cooperation for Development, RCD, and now which is known as ECO. So we're forgetting the joker in the pack is Turkey. We're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about China, but Turkey is as aggrieved today. particularly in the light of developments that have taken place, right? I mean, you can see Turkey is being more assertive, right? And we must not forget that, this is something that a reverse cento can happen. A reverse cento, what was cento? Cento was these three countries as a bulwark to protect the Arab countries and Arab oil, with powers far away, United States, Britain, France, etc. Now, you've got three countries which got more or less the similar interests, right, as far as their own region is concerned, as far as their own countries are concerned, but two countries which now have very good relations with all three countries, Russia and China. Russia has good relations with, reasonably good relations with Turkey, good relations with Iran, good relations now with Pakistan. Similarly, China, of course, has good relations with all three countries. So you're actually talking about different, totally a context, right? And Khalid Saab has said something which I need to endorse, that here it is a great opportunity for engagement. Instead of getting into confrontation and dictating like used to happen in the earlier days, if it can be engagement and constructive engagement, right, which will develop the region, and that economic drive will be a harbinger for peace rather than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you, Ikram Sahab. Let me take some questions from the audience as well, and I'll pose this one to Claude. And we are coming pretty close to the end of the session, the discussion, but let's see how it goes. Claude, there is a question that can China play a more of a conciliatory role between the GCC, Iran, and Turkey, since it doesn't carry any of the baggage, political baggage, and it's focused more on economic development, and for that reason, it has more of a motivation to act as a reconciliatory force between the forces of divergences, GCC, Iran, Turkey, etc.?
That's a very good question. I hadn't put too much thought to that. I suppose if it only focused on the economic sides of things, yes, it can certainly play a conciliatory role there, especially with the BRI and CPEC and all these very, very big investment projects. The only ointment, I would say the fly in the ointment here is one shouldn't forget, and no one's actually brought it up at all, is the treatment of Muslims in China. And it's something that the OIC tends to overlook or not want to talk about. But it's certainly something that's there, and one shouldn't avoid talking about it, and it's not going to go away. But I thought I'd just put that in there as well, because I think it is an important issue that shouldn't be, it's an important human rights issue, the treatment of Uyghurs in China. And I think that should be borne in mind when deal with China, whether on the economic side or on the political side of things.
Okay. Anybody else wants to comment on that? Khalid Saab or Ambassador Kazi?
I think, Claude, I don't know, by an act of omission or commission, we forgot the Uyghur and others. I think these issues should also be taken by those countries who are dealing with China on an economic level. It's not a quid pro quo, it's a human rights situation that is really spiraling out of control. And whatever news items that we read, quote unquote, in the Western media only, is a cause of alarm. And I think it's important that the countries in the region at least voice their concern about what's happening and ask to go and see for themselves the situation on the ground.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. We have a lot of more questions, but I think we don't have enough time to cover all of those. I'll just take a few. There is one question.
The question of
I believe so. I must apologize, but I have to leave another.
All right. Thank you very much, Ikram Saab, for joining.
Assalamu alaikum to everybody.
Nice meeting you.
Well, on the question of human rights, I think what will all help the cause of human rights is non-discriminatory and unified approach on issues of human rights. When we talk of, I mean, there's a lot of talk about Uyghurs in China, but what about Kashmiris, 10 million Kashmiris who are in a lockdown situation for last more than a year? Nobody talks about it, at least in the West. And what about the rights of Palestinians in the occupied areas? What about, I mean, the assimilation and annexation of the Palestinian territories, the likelihood of that, and there's a talk, and United States has endorsed it. United States even has transferred its diplomatic mission from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is in, kind of contrary to the UN resolutions and the status of Palestine issue. So, I mean, these for us are more burning issues than, I mean, transient matters like how a particular, community is being, and we don't have the full details. Also, we have very one-sided view of what actually has happened or happening there. So I think we need to be very balanced when we are seeking for some kind of attention to human rights issues. We should be non-discriminatory in that manner.
Well, there are more questions, but obviously if you schedule an hour, you run out of time. It's a pretty short time to cover a lot of area, and I would like to thank Ambassador Qazi, Khalid Al-Maina Sahab, Dr. Claude Rakisets for taking the time to discuss the various facets of this emerging theme, the likely deal between China and Iran, economic and security deal. And I will conclude with just one observation that I hope that as we look at the past and history, really the conflicts come first. And I'm worried, and I hope that in this case, we are able to see the economic benefits first, and we don't inadvertently end up in a conflict, which has been the lesson of the history. And obviously, we need to learn from history, and that's one of the lessons of the history, that we don't repeat ourselves again and again, and to prevent this balance of power tussles from getting into the military realm. And we can solve it by building bridges economically, BRI or others as well. And it also depends on the US elections. We were not able to cover that in today's discussion, but if there is a change of administration in the US in the coming elections, we may see a little bit of twist in the US as well, and that may have a different outcome as far as the world politics is concerned right now. So saying that, I'm optimistic and at the same time wary of conflict, and hopefully everybody will realize that as we adjust to the balance of powers, the change of the balance of power, we don't have to repeat history. And I guess we coexist, and there is enough space. We realize that there is enough space for everybody. Again, thank you very much for the panelists and the participants for taking the time out to join us for this discussion.